Hi everyone. Hope you are all doing great. Have you ever wondered what does Marxism say about Trump's foreign policy? Well, in today's talk, we will explore how deep structural contradictions within the capitalism shape his aggressive and nationalist strategies. We will uncover the economic roots of imperialist ambitions and class dynamics driven Trump's global actions to see from a critical perspective on US foreign policy in the era of a crisis and decline. So let's start our talk for today. From Marxist perspective, foreign policy can't be understood as a mere product of individual leadership or a strategic choice. Rather, it must be analyzed as an expression of deeper structural imperatives inherent to the capitalist mode of production. The capitalist state, as Marx explained, employs various instruments to ensure the continuation of capitalism and to protect the interests of the capitalist class. Imperialism in classical Marxist theory, particularly in the works of Lenin, Helferjink, and Bukharin, represents the highest stage of capitalism, wherein domestic overaccumulations drives the outward expansion of capital, the search for new markets, and subordinations of peripheral economies. Applying this framework to Trump presidency reveals a foreign policy that, despite its appearance, chaos, and unpredictability, follows a discernible internal logic. It continues a structural response to the deepening contradictions of the US capitalism, particularly the crisis of neoliberal accumulations, widening class inequality, and relative decline of the US hegemony. Having said that, now let's take a look to the domestic roots of the Trump foreign policy. We have to situate Trump's foreign policy within the broader crisis of the US accumulation regime, where in 2008, financial crisis was not merely a cyclical downturn, but a systematic crisis to the new liberal model that had prevailed since the 1980s.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Two-year note yields went from 190 to 166 in the blink of an eye.
On the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
The financializations of the US economy, driven by deregulations and the dominance of rentier capitals, generated profound distribution imbalances. Now let's explain what does the rentier capital means. It means that earning money mainly from the ownership of assets like property, stocks, and patent, rather than from working of producing new goods. So instead of working on creating new products, a rentier makes income from the existing assets. For example, if someone owns an apartment building and earns rent from tenants without actively working in the property, they are earning rentier income. It's not beneficial for the long term of the economic growth. Why? Because this means less investment in productive activities like manufacturing, innovations, or even infrastructure. It leads to investments focusing on assets that generate rent rather than those of boosting productivities and employment. In addition, it will lead to economic instability if those assets prices fall. It will slow down the economic development and technological progress. When people or companies focus only on earning rent from the existing assets rather than creating new products or services. Besides that, the wealth accumulated through the rentier incomes tends to be centered or concentrated among a small wealth elites, which can lead to increased inequality and social tension. So, on the long term, distributional imbalances caused by new liberal wave since the 1980s created the perfect social conditions for Trump would later exploit. The material consequences are stark, where the US middle class population fell below 50% for the first time in 40 years. Declining middle class populations economically means that it will weaken consumer demand, slow the growth, increase inequality, destabilize the economy. Maintaining a robust middle class is crucial for sustainable economic stability and growth. The top 1% now captures approximately 20% of the national pre-tax income, compared to the less than 12% in the 1978. Meanwhile, an estimated 48 million Americans, roughly 1 in 7, experience food insecurity. This profound inequality created a reservoir in population discontent that Trump's mobilized through nationalist and protectionist rhetoric. The extreme national egoism of the capitalist state. Trump's professed America First doctrine represents what is being called extreme national egoism, a formulation that cuts through the confusion surrounding terms like popularism, isolationism. While Trump presents himself as the champion of the ordinary Americans against the establishment, he remains as a member of the monopoly bourgeoisie, the elite, fundamentally subordinate to the interests of the US capital, or merely precisely Wall Street. The apparent contradictions between his anti-establishment rhetoric and his pro-business policies is the result where one recognized that his nationalism served to redirect working class anger away from the capitalist class and toward foreign rivalries. Now let's take a look at core features of the Trump foreign policy. The new MAGA imperialism. Scholars like John Foster characterize Trump's foreign policy as continuing a new MAGA imperialism, a doctrine of renewed U.S. global dominations through aggressive racial nationalism. Despite occasional gestures toward isolationism, Trump's policy represents not a retreat from imperial, but a transformation of its modalities. As Foster argued, the irrationalism of this doctrine points toward what Estevan Miszaros has explained in his book, Socialism or Barbarism, from the American Century to the Crossroads. He termed as potentially deadliest phase of imperialism. He used this term to describe the era of monopoly, finance capital, driven primarily by the United States, as it increasingly resort to the permanent war and coercive dominance of an effort to maintain global hegemony. Following Rosa Luxemburg's rally cry on socialism or barbarism, argued that this phase is the most destructive in history for several reasons. First one, the risk of permanent warfare, where imperial powers rely on continuous military interventions and geopolitical dominance to protect capital accumulations, which threatens global stability and risks even nuclear conflict. Ecological collapse. He argued that relentless drive for infinite profit inherently destroys the natural environment, pushing the planet toward ecological collapse. Third one, erosion of human welfare. The capitalist system uses state power to rule back a social benefit, weaken labor, and lower living standards globally to extract surplus value. So the era of monopoly finance, capital driven primarily by the United States, as it's increasingly resourced to the permanent war and coercive dominations in an effort to maintain global hegemony. So this imperialism is explicit and advantaged, but some scholars would call it gangster imperialism or mafia state logic. Unlike a previous administration that often cloaked imperial ambitions in the language of democracy, promotion of human intervention, Trump's approach abandons such pretenses that the treatment of the international relations as a zero-sum contest, with the threats to seize Greenland, military actions against Iran and Venezuela, and the tariff wars against the allies and adversary alike reveals imperialism in its most naked form. Second feature of Trump's foreign policy is resource imperialism and the logic of preemptive accumulations. Marxist has differentiated between accumulation through productive expansion, which means investment in productive capacity, as we have seen in China model, and the second one, which is the accumulation through appropriations, which means a coercive seizure of assets. Trump's foreign policy leans more towards the latter. Despite his attempts, as we all recall and remember, to revive the industrial age for the United States in 2025, where he imposed tariffs on the imports to encourage the domestic production. But the US reality was quite different. A Wall Street Journal report stated that approximately 500,000 job vacancies remain unfilled. Despite the political luring of the American industrial glory, the reality was entirely different from Trump's aspirations. This can be attributed to several factors, including the very nature of the capitalist system itself, which has led Americans to prefer more comfortable jobs with higher pay. That is, jobs with daily toil and fewer perks will not be preferable for the Americans. Part of the problem also lies in the negative perceptions of the factories. People still remember what happened in the 19th and the early of 2000, where the factories closed and production moved overseas. And they don't believe these jobs are assured or secured. Without a change in the work culture, fair wages, and improved work environment, job vacancies remained mere numbers on paper, unfilled. Because of the difficulty of this option, we find that Trump's restoring to accumulation through seizure, which is the coercive seizure of the assets. His obsession with resource control, his repeated suggestion that the United States will seize Venezuela oil, and now his war in Iran, all embodies what we call it the resource imperialism. As one observer points that Trump's views wealth and power as zero-sum game, believing that control of natural resources will always determine the winner. This represents a regression of an earlier, more preemptive form of imperialism. This is not reminds us of Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, but also of the 17th century trading companies that ushered much of the world into predatory capitalism. The focus on the direct control of land and resources rather than a more subtle mechanisms of the financial and the technological dependence that characterize neoliberal globalizations signals a qualitative shift in the form of the American imperialism. Now, the third infamous feature of the Trump foreign policy is the tariff warfare. Trump tariff policy, from Marxist lens, can't be understood simply as economic nationalism. It's a classical warfare disguised as a foreign policy. Tariff functions as a tax on working class that enables the maintenance of the reduced corporate tax rates. While framed as a strategy to revive manufacturing employment, the burden falls in unequal way on consumers, that is, on workers and the middle class, while the benefit goes always to the capital. Moreover, the claim that other countries have obliged the US fundamentally misunderstood the logic of the global capital. Manufacturing jobs don't migrate abroad because foreign countries stole them. They relocate themselves because the capital flows to where it can maximize accumulations. So US corporations themselves orchestrated this movement in pursuit of higher profit, a process accelerated by neoliberal policies, championed by the US and the UK leaders since the 80s. Trump's nationalist narratives obscure this reality, displacing class antagonism on the international competition only. Fourth feature of Trump's foreign policy can be said the new Cold War. During the Independence Day weekend address at Mount Rushmore, marking the nation's 250th anniversary, Trump stated,
"You can be loyal to Karl Marx, or you can be loyal to America. You can be a communist, or you can be a patriot. You cannot be both."
This highlights the ideological function of Trump's anti-communism policy, especially toward China. Such speeches echoes McCarthy-era Red Scare and the anti-communist hysteria in the United States during the 40th and 50th, which hunts and serves to delegitimize domestic opposition while mobilizing support for confrontation with China. The construction of China as a primary strategic adversary, framed in civilizational terms, provides ideological cover for a new Cold War that serves the interests of the US capital, particularly the military industrial complex, and sectors seeking to contain Chinese economic competition. As Rosa Luxemburg observed over a century ago, militarism is not aggression for its own sake, but rather the preeminent means for the realization of the surplus value. So Trump's war on Iran, Venezuela, serves his function, absorbing surplus capital while displaying both domestic and international labor. Now let's try to anticipate what the era of post-Trumpism would look like. First one, acceleration of multipolarity and the decline of US hegemony. Ironically, Trump's aggression to pursue the US dominance may accelerate US relative decline. The US share of global GDP has fallen to approximately 26%, while BRICS countries now account for 41.7% in 2025. The world is no longer Bretton Woods era configurations, where the US was undisputed manufacturing hub. Trump's disruptions of multilateral institutions and his confrontations with both allies and adversaries encourages the formation of alternative economic and security architectures that reduce the US influence. Second one, intensification of the global inequalities. Western leftist scholars and media have argued that Trump's tariff policies harm workers in both US and abroad, exacerbate inequality and increase the risk of a global recession. The costs are ultimately borne by the working class worldwide. This is non-incidental but structural. Protectionism, far from protecting workers, raises the cost of living while failing to address the underlying dynamics of the capital modality that drives deindustrialization. Before we shift to the next idea, let me just explain and speak a little bit about what do we mean by protectionism. Protectionism is an economic policy where a country imposes restrictions on international trade to protect its domestic industries and jobs by imposing taxes or tariffs on the imported goods to make them more expensive, applying limits on the quantity of imported goods that could enter the country, in addition to a total bans on imports from specific countries. While on the other hand, the government supports domestic industry to make their productions more competitive. In order to protect domestic industry, shielding these domestic industry from the foreign competition, to preserve jobs in domestic industry by preventing a foreign competition from entering the market, and to increase domestic economic growth by promoting domestic industries and jobs. While these were the goals, the outcome might be totally different. Where protectionism can lead to reduced global trade, while can result in higher prices for consumers and reduce access to quality products. In addition to that, tariffs and quotas can increase the cost of living for consumers as prices for imported goods rise. Besides, protectionism can lead also to inefficient allocations of the resources as domestic industries are protected from competitions, and this insufficient are not addressed. Moreover, protectionism policies by one country can lead also to retaliation measures by other countries as well, resulting in a trade war, exactly like what is happening nowadays. More importantly, it can exacerbate inequality by benefiting certain industry or a group at the expense of others, such as consumers who bear the costs of the higher price. So Trump's protectionism policy is a short-term solution that ultimately harms the working class worldwide by increasing the cost of living and failing to address and underlying the dynamics of the capital mobility that drives deindustrialization. Third one, the destabilization of the international order. The Trump administration's turn toward unilateralism and the coercive power politics has a profound implications for the existing international order. The abandonment of even rhetorical commitment of multilateral norms, what we can call it as systematic implementations of a transnational diplomacy and industrial nationalism into traditional multilateralism forms, erodes the international foundation of the post-Second World global governance. The result is increased uncertainty and tension as countries must reposition themselves in relation with the new configurations of the power. First one, domestic class polarization and political realignment. Perhaps the most significant consequences from Marxist perspective is the effect on the US domestic class policies. Trumpism has mobilized heterogeneous movements on working class and petty bourgeoisie elements around a nationalist, revangelist ideology. However, this movement is riddled with profound contradictions as the economic cost of Trump policies become manifest in the job losses, factory closures, and the rising prices. Class lines within the movement will begin to fracture. As Alan Woods argued, that workers will have passed through the school of Trumpism maybe ultimately drew the correct conclusions from it, potentially becoming militias of the future communist movement. Trump foreign policy is not an arbitration, but a symptom of a deeper structural crisis. Trump's unconventional operations are essentially a stress-induced relief for the intensifying social contradictions within the US. The roots lies in the contradictions of the capital accumulation itself, not a peculiar sociology of one individual. Trump foreign policy represents the stripping away of the ideological veils that previously obscured the imperial character of the US foreign policy. The language of human rights, democracy promotion, and rules based order has been largely abandoned in favor of explicit assertion of power. This brute force imperialism makes the structural violence of the capitalist world system more visible, potentially creating conditions for its condensation. As the Trump doctrine is inherently unstable, it attempts to resolve the crisis of the US capitalism through external aggression and internal repression. But these measures can't address the fundamental contradiction between socialized production and the private appropriation. Trump policies are counterproductive. They disturb existing global flows of information, technology, logistics, and capital in a way that ultimately undermine the productivity. This is like drinking poison to quench the thirst, a temporary palliatives that worsen the underlying conditions. So, the ultimate significance of the Trump foreign policy may lie in. By making imperialism more naked and more brutal, it may stimulate the very anti-imperialist resistance it seeks to suppress. The protection of national autonomy will depend largely on the struggle of working people. So, Trumpism, as Sanjay Rao has argued, in this regard, is both highest expression of US imperialism in its current phase and potentially the midwife of its antithesis. That was our discussion for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.